That's some wedding stuff, by the way. That's what we say at weddings. And then the disruptive grace factor is that the daughter-in-law marries the the kinsman redeemer, and he lays with her, and they birth a baby for the grandmama who had married into the family. I'm sorry, that's what it say because she nursed the child. That grandmama did. So that's disruptive grace, though. I always wonder how Boaz really felt at the end of that story. Disruptive grace. So, Zay, what do you see? And these are just spaces of disruption for me with God because they don't make no sense.
One thing I've learned is that God usually covenants with us in our broken spaces.
Ah,
It is in that disruption that God covenant with us. Let's look at Noah as you were talking about this. It was called an ark because it was supposed to represent the ark of the covenant, salvation, everything being restored. And I'm reaching with that one, so don't nobody inbox me. But it is a typecast of this ark because it does represent a covenant. That's why we get the rainbow. That God in this destruction gives a rainbow that we will no longer have. And y'all shout over the rainbow in church, but it's really a covenant of destruction. That it won't be water but fire next time. That's what the rainbow means, is that I'm covenant with you that I won't destroy you again by this very means, but I'm going to destroy you by fire. And that when God entered into covenant with people in the Old Testament, it had to be after the shedding of somebody's blood. It had to be in the breaking of something and the destruction of something, the slicing of something, the cutting of something, in order for us to get covenant. Even when we talk about the new covenant, the new measure of grace, this new grace that happens with Jesus, Jesus has to be broken. Jesus has to be beaten. Jesus has to be murdered and then lynched. We call it crucifixion because it just sounds better and deep, but he was lynched in his day. And it is in that shedding of blood and in that breaking that we will never be, that every disease has been destroyed and every illness, by his stripes we are healed and by his blood we are saved. It is in the breaking, the destruction of something, the disruption of something, the dismantling of something that we have covenant. And so covenant comes out of brokenness. Even when a man and a woman get married in old school and Old Testament thought, she had to have her hymen broken and the sheet had to be hung out over the balcony or out the house so that it could show that he had consecrated the bed and the marriage, and that she was now his after she had been broken. That was not an enjoyable moment for the woman at that time. In African tradition, the woman's clitoris is removed in a form of breaking her so that her husband can only enjoy the act of sex, but that she can only be with him. And so there is, most times we see covenant in the Bible, we see it after something that has been broken, after something that has been disrupted. And even in our culture, the reason I brought up Africa, because we know the Bible comes out of Africa. Y'all know it here, we're going to get that. And so there's always going to be a level of brokenness for covenant that is a hard thing for us to grasp. In fact, I know we have some people who would argue that we like this God who is sadistic, who likes to beat us and who likes to whip us. But that's what the Bible shows us, is that covenant comes out of this disruptive thing. And so even with Job did not get the promise until he had lost everything. And then God gives him more, but he had to lose it all and be broken and ready to dang near die before God said, okay, here you go. Jacob, before he becomes Israel, wrestles with himself and God at the place called Peniel, for I have seen God's face. And it is there that his hip is broken. It signifies something, because the hip in Hebraic tradition meant that was your place of power, your place of strength, your place of vitality. And so if that place is broken, you are now you're a shell of your former self. And so it is in that place that God says, now I will call you Israel, and now you'll be blessed, and now you'll be the father of nations. It is out of brokenness. And so what do we do with our brokenness? How do we deal with a God who likes to break us?
Well, So as Zay says that I go, y'all know I like to read. And so I go get this book because I used this term about 2 years ago. I see some folks that was there at that event. What's up, bro? And I said, because Dr. Itahare is one of the most prolific spiritual beings on the planet.
It's a hurry to Ray.
And when I tell you, Mama Itahare will take you up, down, and all around, and when you land, you feel like you came down on the cloud. And you got to do something with the up and the down that she take you through, though. You gonna have to you gonna have to roll with that because you're gonna replay it. And I was honored to be on a stage sitting next to this woman of God. This it's almost celestial when you sitting with her, like you just be in a cloud. And she was talking about disruption. And I said, well, we have to deal with disruptive grace. Because here's another fact of disruptive grace. Like Zay said, we like to talk about this crucifixion, this lynching. But here's this disruptive grace. Like, I'm born into the earth knowing I'm finna die for something that don't really care about me. Now, that's not the first time we see that in the Bible. Now, you go back to Isaiah and you read it, and Isaiah literally is like, send me, I go. I don't even know what the assignment is. And the assignment is, I'm finna get you to talk to people that ain't gonna even listen to you. So, like, excuse me? And Isaiah did it. But here we are in this disruptive grace of John 17. Now, I'm not a big fan of John, just is so high Christology. It takes me out sometimes when I read it because it just made Jesus look so soft and kind and just like he was gonna take everything. But John 17 is when you see Jesus do a 3-part prayer. And you see the disruptive grace in that. I'm gonna pray for myself. I'm gonna pray for these. I almost said it. It's like, I be trying to work on my words when we on this platform because I love that your church is beautiful. But I wanted to say these resting Negroes. You knew some of them was gonna be like, yeah, I'm about to get mine. Or I ain't gonna deny you, but then deny. And then you had the beloved, but Zay love talk about the beloved. We ain't going to the night Zay. Anyhow, so the beloved it's right there at the feet. But that disruptive grace praying for them. Then the disruptive grace of you praying for people that you don't even know, like, and for those are to come. And I'm like, this is disruptive because you praying a prayer of a death. Like, I'm praying a prayer of death, and then because I'm gonna skip through the Gospels, I'm gonna come back to Matthew because we don't really like to talk about it. It said God turned God's face when Jesus died. So, but John is not a synoptic. It was not formulated in that way. But just to read that and see, for me, that is very disruptive. And so Walter Bergerman, I hope I said it right. I always mess up names.
Brueggemann.
Bergerman. His book is fantastic. It's called Disruptive Grace. In the intro, he even says in the intro that we try to domesticate God because we don't like to talk about God being disruptive because God has to be this colorful, beautiful, joyous, happy moment in our life. And then we literally take our take life, and if it doesn't work in the mystical cloud, then it must be on us because God cannot be a God that is disruptive. And so we try to domesticate God. When I read it, I'm like, oh my God, like, yeah, but God can, in my opinion, you can't find an Old Testament. He's speaking about Old Testament, by the way. We try to domesticate the God of the Old Testament. And so say, like, what does that look like tonight? Because I really think that we have, especially in Black community, when we don't want to get to God doing what God has done, especially in the Hebrew Bible. We don't like to get there. And God is disruptive, but covenant comes out of brokenness.
Covenant comes out of brokenness, and this disruptive God that we don't like to deal with. But it is funny to me. I doing seminary, I found myself becoming a process theologian. And it was funny because I am this apostolic Baptist Pentecostal mixed mystic type. Of Carlton Pearson, when I met him, he doesn't probably remember me, but he laid hands on my chest. He put his hand in my chest and he said, "You are called to do this work. You are a lot like me." And so I said that to say that I got all these pieces mixed up together, and then I found myself falling in love with process theology and this idea that God becomes as I become, and that God is in the process with me. And so, what makes God God is that God has the superior intelligence to mine, that God can see the infinite possibilities of where we are and what we're going through, and God can adjust to be God in that process with me. Why do I bring that up? I bring that up is because we are so busy trying to make God be us that we don't realize that God has made us to be like God. And so, in the process, God is becoming what we need God to be, but we're failing to become what we need to be. I hope that's making sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're missing the God relationship and the Godness in this thing because we're so busy trying to overlay our humanity onto something that has already grown beyond where we are at that moment. God is in the process with us, but because God is this intelligence that is greater than any intelligence, God has already matured and grown. And so that is when God says, "Be ye perfect, as I am perfect." God is actually, that word perfect is not perfect in the sense that we understand it as without sin or without problems or without blemish. It is actually the Greek word called teleos, which means to mature. So God is literally saying, mature, become as I am becoming, grow as I am growing, mature as I am maturing. And so if we understand that God is saying that God is maturing in the process with us, we would stop trying to make God into something else, and we would allow God to be who God is. If we go back to the Old Testament, God says to Moses, "I am that I am. Sit me." And so what it is, oh, I am becoming that which I am becoming. God is always about maturing. God is always about the process. And so we're so busy trying to get to the end. And I'm talking to myself as we go through this. We're so busy trying to get to the end that God is trying to get us into the process. Because in the process, God can get us to the place that we need to be. We always want to talk about the potter, but the potter has to break you before the potter finally finds something the potter is satisfied with. So the process has to be accepted. And so we have to accept our place in the process. Because the potter also, we also talk about the refiner's gold or the refiner.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, it is a process of being burned and being boiled until all the impurities come to the top, and then we have to lose something. And so, what we don't realize is that we've become attached to the impurities. But really, what God is doing when God skims off the top is God is taking that which we don't need, but we become attached to it.
Well, like going through. So again, disruptive grace is what I'm looking at today. Zay is pouring out himself, but the book
I hope I made
invites us to look at it. Can you see? Yeah, the book invites us to look at it like this: that disruptive grace. He invites us to look even beyond what he's talking about. In the writer of the book is saying when we even come to a space of communion table, and this is a community invite to see brokenness. And when I bought this book, I was doing a lot of work around communion and mental health. And it was around the time of Trayvon Martin. Can't believe it's been like 10 years that I have been looking at this. And about 5 years after Trayvon Martin, uh, I did uh, I did a training regarding the communion table and emotional wellness for the Black church. And so I got it from reading parts of this book. And the invite was to see us in our brokenness and not to take for granted the theological implications that our brokenness can bring us back to a communal space for us to understand how to heal in that disruption. And so I laid that statement for him on top of Black Ice, the song Black Ice, with Goody Mob and Outkast. And the reason I did that is because there's a line in that song that invites us to look to see if gated communities are for the people inside of the gate because they don't want to go outside of the gate, or is it to keep people outside of coming into the gate which way is the gate really supposed to go?
Both.
Because sometimes we don't want to see brokenness, so we build gates, we build walls, we build things to keep us away from understanding that the disruptive grace of God is necessary for our healing in self and community. We have to see this multiplicity of who we are, and brokenness is part of that. But we try to demonize that, in my opinion, because if I'm broken, then I'm not doing well with the Lord. But brokenness is necessary, because when you get to the communion table, I break this bread.
I was just about to say, communion and crucifixion teach us that brokenness is necessary. Crucifixion leads us to communion. If there was no brokenness at the cross, there would be no communion at the table. And so we don't understand that there is a level of brokenness. And so I had my book here with me. I don't know where I'll put it right here. I had two books that I was going to use if we need to get there. The Psychology of Shame.
Oh, yeah. Boy,
And,
put that book down. Don't do that to me tonight. That's what you're not going to do.
and The Cost of the Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And so those were the two books that I was going to use to inform what we were talking about today. If we had to get that far, it's that this is what we're called to, but it requires more. It requires more than sometimes what we're willing to give. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, if this cup could pass from me, but nevertheless, not my will, and then he goes into this psychological, yet this psychosomatic experience where he begins to pray until blood comes out of his pulse. That's actually a psychosomatic issue. He's actually having a nervous and mental break. He's being broken mentally to prepare him for the breaking and the brokenness that's going to come physically. Because what is happening is a psychological issue where his body is responding to the trauma his mind is going through. I wish I had a Hammond right now, because that would be a good place to close if I was at a church. That many of us are responding to psychological issues physically, and so that's why we're seeing a high number of us dying, not just from suicide, but from cancers and from getting ulcers in our bodies and having all types of heart attacks and strokes and aneurysms. Is because our body is responding to the psychotrauma, because we have not been able to properly deal with the brokenness that is happening in our lives. And we're not learning how to take it to a table and share it with each other. And so here I break the bread as my body was broken, and I share my blood. I share this wine as my blood will be freely shared. And as you do this, and so this brokenness becomes a part of what we call in the Church Universal or the Catholic Church, the sacraments. It is one of the things that God tells us we must do. I feel, and so Jesus says that if you're going to share with me, you must take communion. It's one of those things that Jesus tells you got to do, is that you got to learn how to take your brokenness and bring it to the table and share with it. You got to be able to lay your bread at the table and let somebody break it, and then take your blood. And so we're so busy trying to hold on to the blood because the blood gives us life, but really it is in the sharing of the blood and the breaking of the bread that we see life more abundantly. It's that we don't learn how to deal with, and we don't learn how to process the brokenness.
So because you know what, when I tell y'all spirit is real, like Holy Spirit is real, because I promise we're supposed to be talking about parenting tonight. There's parenting, and we're supposed to continue with talking about parenting. But no, this was necessary. I think parenting was supposed to wait, because parents now don't know how to take the brokenness from what they have, put it on the table so that they can heal before they provoke wrath on their children. Like, this is why this was necessary. You have people who don't know how to be in relationship with anyone because they don't know how to announce their brokenness and put it on the table. They don't know that table, because we celebrate this communion table, but Christ was literally saying, I'm about to break. Yeah, go back and read the text. This is my body, which is broken for you.
He's speaking in a tense that says it's already happened
It's
as it's happening.
already happened, which means
As it's happening. Oh.
I'm breaking, right? So I'm broken and I'm breaking. That's why I mentioned John 17 when he gives these three, for me, three distinct prayers. Because this broken man who is now sweating and crying blood in this anxiety ridden psychological space where he has not been able to really deal because I'm about to lose everything on some wood that I can't even carry all the way. For some people that at this point you celebrated me last week. Cause y'all know Lent started on yesterday. Y'all celebrated me last week with some palm leaves, and I was on a donkey. And y'all about to kill me this week. Like, I'm broken. The brokenness started before we get to the cross. So a lot of y'all like, well, the Bible say that he wasn't gonna have no broken bones, but that didn't mean it didn't say anything about the fact that he wasn't gonna have a broken heart. Matter of fact, it does. It says that God has got a broken hearted. Please understand the brokenness
Contrite.
started. You see where the brokenness started. So here we are in this broken space. So the table is designed for you to come and bring the brokenness. So we get to at this table, First Corinthians 11. You know, I agree with Paul when he write, and he said, don't come to this table thinking that you done already ate at home and you can sit here and talk about folk. Bring your brokenness to the table too. And so disruptive grace, if we had to do some points tonight, sounds like the third point would be that disruptive grace requires you to bring your brokenness to the table so that you can understand the importance of the sufficiency of that disruptive grace.
That is the point of disruptive grace. For my grace is sufficient. In thy weakness, I have been made strong. So it is at the point of brokenness again that we see that grace, this disruptive grace, it is the point of it. It's that you will bring it. Because when you confess your faults one to another, you are healed. That's the book. And they overcame. Go to Revelation, since y'all like to talk about we in the last days. Let's go to Revelation. And they overcame the enemy. They overcame Jezebel, the spirit of dissension and the spirit of discord. They overcame it by the blood of the Lamb and the word of they told what they had been through and how they had been broken, and they shared it, and it empowered. That's why the devil don't want us to get back in the building in the church. If I can be real churchy right now, that's why the devil don't want us to get back in the building of the church and begin to have testimony service again. Because the devil know if you start to tell Margaret how you almost let go, in 2021. And then the 2022 came around, and you started seeing stuff that it didn't look like how you wanted it, but as you took account and begin to look back at how God brought you, and you start to tell that, somebody else will stand up and say, I almost let go in 2022 myself. I was getting ready to pull the trigger, but God came in and saved me. If we talk about it, I watched the TV show, I watched the broadcast, I watched the internet service, and it saved me. See, if we start to go back to sharing and bringing it to the table, we'll forget about the actual table, and we'll start fighting over consubstantiation and transubstantiation. We'll just talk about the fact that the elements were there. The elements were there. What we needed was at the table. At the table, I got what I needed, for my grace, or the grace of God was sufficient. For my power is made perfect in weakness. That's what it said. I'm just. So that's the point of disruptive grace, is to get us to a place to say, you know what? I can't handle this. It was too much. I'm in a broken marriage, and I'm trying to hold on to it because I'm trying to prove people wrong that it wasn't the right thing to do in the first place. I'm crying on the inside because I want to let go, and I'm getting rope burns on my hand because I'm holding on to something that's too heavy. My mama died, and she died, and I had some art with her, and I couldn't deal with it. So I'm just holding on to the fact that she died, and I'm acting as if I just loved her that much. But really why I'm holding on to it is because I got some undealt with issues, and I can't tell nobody because we got to keep what happened in the house because we don't take what happens outside the house. But Tyler Perry, when he put on that dress one day, helped me. And this before he got the good lace front. This was before he got the good one. He said this in one of them plays when the microphone set in the middle of his forehead, right there in between his eyebrows. When he had that, when he was that Medea. She said, sometimes you got to tell what happened in the house. And I'm paraphrasing, but she said, sometimes you got to tell, because some of y'all hold on to stuff and keeping stuff that happened in the house on the inside of you, and it's breaking you, but it's not breaking you the right way. It's hurting you. You got to share it. You got to get it out. And God tells us that. God tells us that in the text, that if you bring it to the table and bring it to the table and leave it there, is your all on the altar of sacrifice. Like, how can they say this? Because I know somebody's gonna try to argue with me and say I'm reaching. Well. If you look at the biblical text, and I believe it's Psalm 23, and thou preparest a table before me. That is a Hebraic word called the shulchan. And this shulchan is the same word. When you look at the word shulchan in Hebrew, it is the word table. Yeah, we get the word table, but it's also the table for the table of sacrifice. But it's the table of communion, but it is also the king's table. It's the same word for three different instances. And so when you bring it to the table, the king sits at the table and you are sacrificing to bring it at the table, but it is also the table of communion that we're sharing. If you don't believe me, look it up. It's in, if you got a good Strong's concordance, it's over there in Hebrew. If you turn about halfway through the Hebrew text of the Strong's dictionary, you'll find it. And it's the shulchan. It's the shulchan, and it blessed me the first time I studied it, because I was like, every time I come to the table, I'm getting elevated, but I'm also giving something up. And so I'm leaving something at the table. It's a sacrifice. But then I'm going up because I'm sitting with kings. I'm sharing, but I'm also communing with others who are in the same situation. That's what the table is. And so that's why I said what I said. And so we got to bring it to the table. And so we got to go.
That's like, because you about to go in to preach, and I'm gonna let you have it after this. You right there. But I don't want to bring it to the table. Now I'm going to be this app. I don't want to come to this table, because the table that I keep coming to keeps looking like this 1 Corinthians chapter 11 table, where I got folks that's just spectating at the table and you trying to eat with me too. Like, I don't have time for that, because now this disruptive grace got me looking crazy. But
that's the place where we got to be at, that we got to be willing to share it even with the spectators, because the text says, and I will prepare a table before you in the presence. See, many of us can't deal with the table because we too busy looking at the folk around us. Now, I don't agree with anything this woman has said for the last 15, 20 years. Paula White ain't been right since Randy left her. But she said something before Randy left. She preached this sermon, and I believe she took it from T.D. Jakes and modified it. But she preached this sermon, and she talked about this table. She didn't tell me about the shulchan, because she didn't go there. That was beyond her. But she talked about this table and how you have to be willing to eat in the presence of your enemy. See, the blessing is being able to partake at a table you don't want to take in. Because there are some disadvantages to sitting at the table. See, when you sit at the table and you got spectators and enemies around you, you have been put at a fighting disadvantage, because your enemies are standing up and you are seated. And anybody that's ever been in a fight knows that it is hard to be able to combat what's coming at you when you're seated and they're standing over you. You never want to be seated or laying down, typically, if your enemy is standing up. Number two, you're at a disadvantage because you are busy and you are doing something else, and so you are not focused and you're not prepared for what's around you. And so at this table, you now have, and then you're thirdly at a place where you have to completely trust that who has prepared the table is also going to protect you while you're at the table. And so that's why in Psalm 23, he said, and surely the goodness and mercy shall follow me. Because although I'm at the table, I've got to be protected because I'm surrounded by folk who don't want to see me move. And I also got to deal with my own self because I'm being broken while I'm sitting at this table that is really set for kings. See, kings understand the ideal of being broken because there's a sacrifice before you can ever ascend to the throne.
And some of us might understand, if you're not a good Bible scholar, you might understand the words of Shirley Chisholm. She said, if they ain't got no seat for you at the table, go and
Make
bring
your
your
own.
own. bring your own. Bring your own.
Yeah.
So again, I'm at a table. I don't want to eat it, but my blessings at the table in front of my enemies. And if I sit down and eat, they could watch me. They got me. But then I got to trust in this goodness and mercy that's following me.
Because disruptive grace puts me in places where I'm uncomfortable and where I cannot, because his grace is sufficient, and I am made strong in thy weakness. It's because I have to be willing to submit and give up at this place where I am uncomfortable. And that is the problem in this generation, is that we don't know how to deal with uncomfortability. Discomfort we automatically assume or place as something wrong, but discomfort sometimes is the preparation for elevation. I remember being a little boy, and I was a nerd. If y'all can't tell, I like to read. I like words. I like to read, and that was this story called "The Princess and the Pea." And the prince wanted to know which woman was the best woman, and so they put different. But he said the right woman would be able to understand, because I'm going to make it uncomfortable for her. And if she can and if in her discomfort she can realize what's going on, she's there. So he put a pea under the mattress, and she slept on it. But she talked about how she was uncomfortable because of the pea, and that led to her becoming the queen. It's about you. You got to understand that sometimes you got to go through something to get to something. The Princess and the Pea. It taught me that sometimes you got to go through something. You got to go through something. You got you that and but you can't. But also it taught me you can't sweat the small stuff. You can't let the little pea stop you from getting what you got to get. You got to find some way to be able to bring it to the table and let it all, as the old songwriter said, let it all hang out. One of my favorite preachers is the older brother of the most well-known preacher. His name is Bishop James.
Oh, you're not gonna take us out with James Morton. That's what you're not gonna do. They don't
And
please
James
don't make me run around this hotel room.
and James Morton preached a sermon one day, and James has this very sharp voice. And James said one day, he said, "You gotta let your hair down. You just gotta let your hair down." And he talked about Samson's hair growing back. And when Samson's hair grew back, Samson was able to perform great miracles. But it was in Samson. Watch this. Samson had his eyes gouged out. Samson was locked up. Samson was in between two poles, locked in between and being made fun of. And Samson's hair grew back, and he felt his hair grow back, and he pushed. And the text says that Samson did more in his death than he did in his entire life, because it was at that moment that he fully surrendered, because he said, "God, if I shall do what you said, give me one more good," and he pushed one good time. It's when you let your hair down. And James began to hoop at that moment. I can't do what James did, because he found some crazy key, and he went there. Let your hair down. Ah! And everybody just started screaming. I myself took off running. But it's the point that we gotta learn how to let it out, how to be free, and how to accept where we are. And so I answered your question, Margaret. Can we go at that table? Is that you got to be able to accept it. You got to be able to accept the table that's been prepared for you.
And I was reading about Samson the other day, because I am one. I'm a fan of Delilah. People gonna slap me when they see me. But let me tell you why. The lady stuck to her job. It never says in the text that she was not doing her job. She literally asked the brother, "What's the key to your strength?" That was her job. That's what they asked her to do. We try to demonize that woman, but no, she stuck to her guns and did her job. Now, what I will say is that he did more in his death than he did when he was living, because he lost his sight before his eyes were gouged out. Some of us are sitting in spaces of disruptive grace because we've lost sight of what the purpose of the strength is for. And we miss when the enemy is coming direct. We miss it because we thinking that we can play around with it. So here's this disruptive grace. So now I got this thing that I can't get rid of because I'm sitting in a disruptive space, but that's not on God. That no, because I gave you strength for one thing. But you take for granted when something's coming to do its job. And so he did more in his death. But here's the disruptive grace, because it had to be a disruption, because I don't know if Samson would have done what he was supposed to unless life was interrupted because he lost sight before he lost his eyes.
The gouging was just a manifestation of what had happened in the spirit. And so we're asking what is happening. I'm not going to mean to go here, but we're asking what is happening with all of these deaths of pastors and apostles and bishops and elders who we thought would be here a little bit longer. It's because what is happening in the spirit is manifesting as we're moving. God is disrupting some of our lives and some of our thoughts and some of our things so that new people can stand up. It doesn't mean that the people who are dead were wrong. It just means that God had to move them so that we could see. The prophet said this. The prophet said this. It said, it was in the year that King Uzziah died that I saw the Lord high and lifted up. It was when I lost my good friend, because you got to understand the text. You got to understand the text. You got to read in between the lines. See, the prophet and Uzziah had some good relationship because Uzziah supported the prophet's ministry. And so he prayed for he prayed for the prophet by paying for the prophet. Somebody will catch that a little bit later. And so sometimes you got to pay for the prophet in order to show that you're praying for the prophet. And so he supported the ministry of the. I ain't talking about the holes in prophecy. I'm talking about the real that's supporting it. And so he was one who supported the ministry. They had a relationship where they entered where the prophet would give him words for the kingdom and would help him, and in turn the king would bless him. And so they had a great relationship. But it wasn't until Uzziah died that he saw the Lord high and lifted up. See, the text didn't just say I saw the Lord high, because it could have stopped right there, and that would have been enough to shout off that I saw the Lord high. I saw the Lord high. I saw the Lord sitting high. I saw the Lord high on the Lord's throne. It would have been enough to shout. But the text says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and the Lord's train filled the temple. So I was in the Lord's house because I was trying to process the death of my good friend. I was being disrupted and broken because I had lost something I didn't think I was ready to lose. And while I was in the temple, the Lord showed up high and exalted. So I saw the Lord in the Lord's rightful place, but I also had now to worship the Lord and lift the Lord higher than where the Lord had really been. I saw the Lord high and lifted, and then the glory of the Lord filled the train. So the train was the representation of the glory, the power, the authority, the regalness of who God is. I saw the Lord's train fill the temple. It consumed what I was dealing with. So I got to realize that this disruptive grace is there to bring me to a place to where I can see the Lord high and lifted, and the Lord's train can fill my temple.
That brings me back to how we started. How you talked about perfection, and that's maturity. And if God can get to the point of vulnerability that the train is filling the temple, but we find Isaiah later on up under this robe. We got to find a space to be vulnerable enough to understand that. For Isaiah to be up under the robe, it wasn't just the train. Isaiah was up under that thing, which means he's seeing God
in a way that many of us hadn't seen God.
And seen God.
Because our vulnerability allows God to be vulnerable. Because I go back to my process theology. If God is in the process with us, God can't let us outdo God. Because God is a jealous God. He ain't God. And so God, since God is so jealous, God's got to always make sure that God is ahead of the curve. And so if Isaiah is up under the train, there's an implication that was something that Isaiah let God into. And so since Isaiah is letting God in, God has to now let Isaiah in. And so there's an implication in the text. There's an implication in the text. I wish I had time to deal with the implication in the text. And so I wish I had time to go to my Bailey and then come back on around. But I ain't got time to deal with Bailey. I ain't got time to be Randall Bailey and talk about the fact that God reveals something up under that temple. God reveals an inner part of God. God reveals a sacred part of God to him. And that's why he falls under the train and goes out, because he got to see something that not many people got to see. Look at Moses in the cleft of the rock. Moses says, show me your front. And God said, you can't handle the front. So I'll lift up and I'll let you see my back. I'll show you my backside. I'll show you what I've already done. I'll remind you of where you've already been. I'll remind you of what, because if you can just remember where you come from, where you're going won't be so much of a problem, because I can show you the backside. And so if I can just show you a place that you don't remember, if I can show you a place that you hadn't seen and you hadn't touched, it was there. And so Isaiah and Moses are both having experiences that we all wishing that we had. Hide me, God. Hide me in the cleft of the rock. Let me see something I have never seen. And so in the year that King Uzziah died, I just want to see it. Hide. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish.
Oh, you finna finish? Because this is the last thing Margaret has to say. Because I feel his preach and I want him to do it. And I'm not even gonna say it. And so, we sit here and we get frustrated with the text. We get frustrated with God even, and which is fine. You got parts of you that just like, I'm over this. I told you I was gonna do right. Those who know me personally know, I'm a cussing preacher. And sometimes you really are over this with God. Like, I'm over this sufficient grace. I'm over this thorn. I'm over all of it. Like, you promised me something, I ain't seen it. But here's a space of vulnerability. When you bring your brokenness to the table, then do I have to bring it to this table that's prepared for me in the presence of my enemies? Do I have to bring it to a table that's full of petty folks that you didn't already ate before you even got here, but all you see is my brokenness and my poverty? Do I need to come to a table with a Negro? I'm gonna go ahead and say it. You're not already prepared to sell me anyway, and I gotta invite you to leave because you're trying to eat my bread and make money off me at the same time, while I'm dealing with the other Negroes who finna sweep them down. They finna be with me, but they the first ones to deny me. Like, do I have to come to that kind of table? Do I have to come to a table where I know that at the end of the day I'm gonna have a panic attack before I gotta go finish some stuff? What does that look like? Do I have to carry a thorn because of this freaking table that requires me to have sufficient grace that is disrupting my life? Yes. Walter said it better than I can, because at its heart, the biblical tradition is not about control, but about vulnerability. I know some of y'all don't want to hear that. Vulnerability, not about self-sufficiency, but about risky reception of life as a gift. This is disruptive grace. This is how we sit with it. Because you still live in this gift of life, made in the image of God, the same God you frustrated with. They made you good, and you sitting here like, what the? But it's a space of vulnerability and actually saying what it is. I've watched as a therapist when people just say what it is. And when they say it, it's like a light goes off.
And the
now
weight lifts.
The weight lifts. And disruptive grace isn't as weighty. In the sufficiency of that disruption, you find praise. You find a way to lift up in spaces because you're in vulnerable space. You see yourself instead of comparing yourself to what you don't have. You see what you do have and understand the gift of life, and it's still growing and moving. I now can see why Job we didn't see the writer put what Job was still down and out. No, it was no replacement family. He still had grief. But now, instead of praying for somebody else, I can actually say, you know what, you my God, I'm going to pray for myself. I can completely see why David, even being chased by his son who tried to kill him for a kingdom, can lay there in his deathbed and said, I don't need the virgin girl. My life has been good. I can see, because he was ready to go. I can see where you got people who fought like Jeremiah to say, I don't want to do this, that in the middle of a lament can come back and say, great is thy faithfulness, your mercies renew every morning. I can see that when I realize that vulnerability is the space where disruptive grace takes flight. And so I can bear this thorn. The sufficiency of grace makes sense. And so I want to see what disruptive grace can do for me because I do serve a God that's disruptive.
And that's what Paul was saying. You hit it. You hit it. You went where I was going. That's what Paul was saying. Paul said, I prayed thrice, 3 times for this thorn to be removed. And he said a messenger. But I want to go back to the A clause of that because he says it was the messenger of the Lord that brought it. And it goes back to everything you just said. He said it was a messenger of the Lord that brought this and gave it as a gift. Go back and read it. Just read. Y'all don't believe me. Y'all think I'm lying. Go back and read it. It says it was a gift from the Lord that the messenger, depending on which text you read, depending on which book you read, depending on which verse you read when they talk about the messenger, sometimes they use the word malak, a special messenger of the Lord. That's sometimes the same word they use for apostle. or angel, it was just a special messenger. They had a special word, and so the word from the Lord for Paul was that he had to suffer. He had a thorn. Now there is some talk about what the thorn was. I don't have time to deal with what the thorn could possibly be. There's some belief that the thorn was something that Paul did not want because Paul had come from a background that would not agree with the thorn that he dealt with. And that is why Paul possibly had a conversion on the road of Damascus, is because Paul had to realize who he was and how God was still calling him and using him in spite of who he was. I wish I had time to really deal with that. Is that sometimes God is calling some of y'all in spite of who you are. I feel like I'm talking to somebody. It's like 3 people watching, but I'm talking to you right now that you're dealing with the fact that God is still calling you and you've dealt with some stuff and you're dealing with some stuff and you're dabbling with some stuff. But God is still calling you because a messenger has given you this thorn to buffet you. The book says to buffet. It means to literally knock both this way and that way to do it. And he said, I prayed thrice that this thorn would be removed. And the Lord said, no. What happens when God tells you no? How do you handle a God that you prayed for? And especially in this dispensation where we think that every time we pray, God is supposed to say yes. God says no. And not only does God say no, but God says, but my grace is sufficient. You know you got it. Other folk may see a thorn and they may suspect what you got. But my grace is sufficient to allow you to work in what I've called you to do, although you got this thorn. What you got should disqualify you. But disruptive grace allows you to see that what I got, although it should disqualify me, is actually the very thing that allows me to be able to do what God has called me to do. For my grace is sufficient. My grace is sufficient for you to walk away. My grace is sufficient for you to tell them no. My grace is sufficient for you to say, I've given my all. My grace is sufficient for you to go back to school. My grace is sufficient for you to write the book. My grace is sufficient for you to love again. My grace is sufficient for you to love yourself. My grace is sufficient for you to walk back in the gym and say, I'm going to put it down and I'm going to make this thing work this time. My grace is sufficient because it was a thorn. Them thighs have been a thorn, but God's grace is sufficient.
You better preach that.
That abusive husband and wife has been a thorn, but my grace is sufficient for you to walk away. See, the issue is many times we don't want to give up what the grace has given us the ability to handle, to live without. So I'm done. I think me and Margaret are done. I think we have hit our moment of, I'm not going to even pray. I'm just going to ask a question in prayer. And I'm going to say, Lord, do what you do when you do what you do. If you ever heard me preach, you know that's my prayer when I get ready to preach. Lord, do what you do when you do what you do. My question in prayer, as I've already given you the benediction, and Lord, do what you do, is what is grace giving you the strength to handle? But also, not only what is grace giving you the strength to handle, what is grace giving you the strength to let go of? What is God's grace sufficient enough for you to do or to leave? And so I want to be transparent. Y'all know I like to be transparent. Um, I'm dealing with God and myself in ministry and starting something. I don't want to do it. I want to go somewhere that's already established. I'm also dealing with God on this fact that I'm an educator in a system that I don't think supports the educator as much as it supports the people who don't want to be educated. And so, God, why do you have me here? Why am I constantly in this situation where my presence reveals, disrupts, shakes, and then I get misnomered as somebody who is hard to work with and hard to get along with. So I'm dealing with this. And so when we start talking about this, I literally was ready to talk about, parents not pushing your child around. I had some good stuff I want to say. And then the Lord completely wrecked us because Margaret started talking. And we started talking to Carmen, who if Margaret was to pan out, you see her around that corner. We started talking to Carmen, and it just came out, disrupted grace, because I think God needed me to deal with myself. I feel like Jacob now. My name is no longer Zay. It's something else. I don't know what God is calling me. But I feel like Jacob at that tree at Peniel, where I just wrestled with God as I was talking to y'all. God was dealing with me that I am in a space now. And I know that we are the first partakers. And I'm trying to end this, but I feel like somebody needs to hear this or somebody's going to watch this in perpetuity. That God is really calling us to this place of wrestle. And that we had to talk about this sufficient grace because where we're going, God is gracing us to move into the next dispensation. I feel prophetic anointing. I feel it. I'm not going to go into it, but I feel a heavy weight of the glory of God, that there are not just going to be people that God is going to raise up that everybody has put their hands on. But that literally, as God is disruptive grace is so much more that it's going to really disrupt the church because it's going to be some folk that don't look like what that has been accepted. And so we're seeing this dispensation and we're seeing this movement because God is going to bring some folk who have some backgrounds and some stuff into the church and move the church into a place that we have not been open to receive. That's why COVID came, to get us open to some stuff. COVID is a form of disruptive grace. It has shaken some things. It has caused some churches to shut down because they need to be closed 20 years ago, but they didn't want to do it. So COVID came and shook it. It was some preachers that had to go and they would not sit down. And so COVID came. It was some gatekeepers who wouldn't open the door. And so COVID came. And so now it's some new gatekeepers that, opened the door. And I'm telling you, it's before this year's over with. Yeah, it's gonna be some prosperity shifting. It's gonna be some money coming to some folk. It's gonna be some businesses opening up. It's gonna be some shifts happening, but it's also gonna be some more death. Mm-hmm. But even in that, grace is sufficient, and that this disruptive grace is happening so that God can raise up and God can do and God can open up people. And so that's my prayer. I've done my prayer. I'm done.
There's nothing else to put on it. So y'all see the scroll bar. We're not finna solicit for that out loud because I'm not finna interrupt what's there. Some people, we can't see our comments on here, but I pulled them up. So you got people who said this was right on time for them. Say, this is what they needed tonight. And so disruptive grace is normally right on time. So we finna head out. We love you all. Thank you for supporting Lift Moments on the Mend. If this blessed you tonight, y'all know what to do. And we'll see y'all next week.